The middle-aged husband and wife found the perfect apartment, ground floor, nice street in a nice neighborhood, reasonable rent. The landlord seemed decent enough, a private individual, not a big corporation, just someone who'd invested their savings into a buy-to-let property, hoping for a steady income, capital appreciation over time, and a quiet life. What the landlord in this story got was anything but. Welcome to Bonnie and Clyde Tenants. Welcome back to Fraud Files. My name is Emily, and I'm the interviewer on this podcast, which brings you real-life case files and forensic insights into a number of white-collar frauds, financial crimes, and scams that your host Edward has personally encountered and in some cases brought to light during his financial, corporate, and business career. He shines the spotlight on both the frauds and the perpetrators. So, Edward, what true crime story and lessons to be learnt have you got for us today?
Hi, Emily. Today's episode is called Bonnie and Clyde Tenants. And I want you to hold that image in your mind. Bonnie and Clyde. Two people. A partnership. A shared plan. Because that's what makes this particular fraud different from your garden variety scam. This isn't a lone operator. This is a duo. A couple. Two people who look at each other across the breakfast table and decide, together, to take someone for everything they can. In public, they present themselves as the perfect, responsible couple, carefully vetted and always smiling. Behind closed doors, however, their private world is a calculated scheme of deception. They've mastered the art of manipulation, using the law as a weapon to string along landlords while living rent-free.
Are you saying that the fraudsters are using the law to their advantage? That seems like an irony.
So, most of us understand the basic relationship between a landlord and a tenant. It's a contract. You rent a property, you pay your rent, you treat the place with reasonable care, and in return the landlord provides you with a home, a place where you have what's called quiet enjoyment. That's actually a legal concept, by the way. It means your landlord can't just walk in whenever they feel like it, can't harass you, can't make your life difficult. And as long as you're holding up your end of the deal, you have rights, real enforceable rights. And those rights exist for a very good reason. History is full of bad landlords, exploitative landlords, landlords who treated tenants appallingly. So the law stepped in, and rightly so, to protect ordinary people renting their homes. But here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody really wants to talk about. These same protections, designed to shield the vulnerable, can be turned into weapons.
So some tenants, bad actors, use the veil of the law to perpetrate their fraud.
Yes, that's exactly what Bonnie and Clyde tenants do. They move in. They seem perfectly normal. They pay their first month's rent, maybe the second. They're pleasant, communicative, no apparent red flags, and then gradually, or sometimes quite suddenly, the rent stops. Now at this point, a landlord's instinct is to pick up the phone, to ask, what's going on, to sort it out. And that's where the script flips. Because suddenly, the landlord isn't dealing with a tenant who's struggling. They're dealing with a claimant. A formal complaint arrives about the property. Maybe it's the damp. Maybe it's a broken boiler that was reported weeks ago and never fixed, they say. Maybe it's a structural issue or a safety concern, or a failure to maintain the property to a habitable standard. The complaints are detailed, they're documented, there are photographs, there are dates. And here's the thing. Some of those complaints might even have a grain of truth to them. No property is perfect. Every landlord has maintenance issues from time to time. But in the hands of Bonnie and Clyde, a slightly drafty window becomes a habitability crisis. A slow drain becomes evidence of neglect. Every minor imperfection is catalogued, weaponized, and presented as grounds for withholding rent. Typically, they might stop paying rent while simultaneously flooding the landlord with complaints about fake maintenance issues to create a paper trail. They do this to muddy the waters, so that if an eviction is filed, They can claim the landlord is retaliating or that the property is uninhabitable.
So the landlord is now in an impossible position.
Yes, I'm afraid so. They can't simply remove the tenants. The law doesn't work that way, and nor should it. Eviction is a legal process. It takes time. It costs money. And if there are outstanding complaints about the property, even contested ones, those complaints can stall proceedings further. In many jurisdictions, a landlord who hasn't addressed maintenance issues may find themselves unable to pursue possession until those issues are resolved to the court's satisfaction. The legislation has shifted the balance in favor of tenants remaining in occupation. That's not inherently wrong. Security of tenure matters, but it doesn't mean that the window of opportunity for Bonnie and Clyde is wider than ever. They can stay, they can fight, and every week they stay without paying rent is money in their pocket and money out of the landlord's. Meanwhile, the landlord is hemorrhaging cash, and the situation is turning into their worst nightmare. There's the mortgage to service on the property, because most private landlords have one. There's the legal advice they now desperately need. There are solicitors' letters going back and forth. There are tribunal hearings to prepare for. There are sleepless nights and mounting stress and the dawning, horrible realization that this situation, which started with a missed rent payment, has turned into a full-blown legal war.
So, do you have experience of bad tenants who are known to you?
Yes, I've encountered situations like this through my social networks. And what always struck me wasn't just the financial damage, though that was severe. It was the psychological toll. Landlords, ordinary people, remember, not faceless corporations, who felt completely blindsided, who couldn't understand how a tenancy that started so normally had turned into this. It's not easy being a landlord at the best of times. If you get a difficult tenant who for whatever reason stops paying rent, it's almost impossible, and certainly a very lengthy process to evict them.
We have the context. Now for the real-life situation and your story.
And I would like to turn our attention now to a brazen scheme that unfolded a few years ago. A husband and wife, a pair of swindlers. I know them personally, but let's call them Colin and Nancy for the purpose of this podcast. A pair of swindlers, acting with calculated precision, managed to secure an apartment and live there rent-free for 2 years. Using a facade of trustworthiness, they exploited the system, manipulating the landlord by delaying payments and promising non-existent funds. This case highlights the vulnerability of property owners and the importance of rigorous background checks and verification, even when dealing with those who appear respectable and charming. And in this devastating case, the couple, the swindlers, systematically stripped the landlord, an elderly man, of his financial security. It was his pension, so the non-payment of the rent was jeopardizing his retirement and leaving him in a profoundly vulnerable position. He had a wife, he had his own family, and this rental scenario, what seemed like respectable people who paid the rent initially but then stopped paying the rent and started to counterclaim for various issues in the property, was causing him a lot of anxiety. And I was aware of the developing situation through feedback that I was getting from other friends. An elderly man who's worked all his life and has put his savings into a property to act as his pension shouldn't have to face such trauma. And the tragedy in this situation was compounded by his subsequent passing. He passed away shortly after the tenants had voluntarily vacated the apartment, but only after having withheld rent for a couple of years. At the time of his passing, the legal proceedings for the recovery of the rent arrears were still ongoing. They had been dragging on, and it left his wife and surviving family not only dealing with the fallout of the fraud, the massive arrears of rent, but also grieving an irreversible emotional loss. During the administration of the late man's estate, the family decided to drop the proceedings against the tenants. They had lost a husband, a father. The money wasn't important now. Bonnie and Clyde, known as Nancy and Colin in this case, had got away with it.
This is a sad tale indeed, but we need you to push on to see what it tells us about human nature and about the collusion that can often be a part of calculated and premeditated fraud.
Here's what separates the Bonnie and Clyde tenant from someone who's genuinely struggling to pay rent. It's the partnership, the collusion, the shared intent. One person alone can default on rent. One person alone can raise a complaint. But it takes two people who are completely aligned, who trust each other completely, who have planned this together to sustain this kind of coordinated, escalating campaign that Bonnie and Clyde run. Think about what that requires. They have to agree on the strategy from the outset or arrive at it together as the situation develops. They have to maintain a consistent story to each other, to the landlord, to solicitors, potentially to a tribunal or court. They have to document their complaints carefully, respond to correspondence in a coordinated way, and crucially, they have to be willing to stay the course, to live in that property under that tension for months, sometimes years. That's not impulsive behavior. That's partnership fraud. And like all the best cons, it works in part because it exploits something legitimate, tenants' rights, and hides behind it. And often, it doesn't stop with just one scheme. Once these professional scammers realize they can manipulate the system, the temptation to branch out can be irresistible. Many of them go on to commit identity theft, credit card fraud, or even insurance scams, transferring their skills and their partnership to new lucrative targets. They become career criminals, always looking for the next loophole to exploit.
So what can landlords do to protect themselves?
First, due diligence before the tenancy begins. Reference checks matter. Credit checks matter. But so does something less formal, your instincts, and a careful look at the tenancy application. Have these tenants moved frequently? Are there gaps in their rental history that aren't easily explained? Second, documentation from day one. A thorough inventory, photographs, a written record of the property's condition, and that both parties then have to sign. This isn't just good practice, it's your first line of defense if complaints start arriving about issues that didn't exist when the tenancy began. Third, respond to legitimate maintenance issues promptly and keep records of every action you take. If a boiler needs attention, get it seen to and keep the receipts and correspondence. Don't hand Bonnie and Clyde ammunition they can use against you. And fourth, if things start to go wrong, get legal advice early. Don't wait until you're 6 months into arrears and knee-deep in counterclaims. The earlier you engage properly with the process, the better your position.
Let's conclude by reflecting on the moral of this story.
The sad truth is that fraud doesn't always arrive wearing a mask. Sometimes it arrives with a signed tenancy agreement, a deposit, and a very pleasant handshake. The Bonnie and Clyde tenants aren't opportunists in the traditional sense. They're planners. They're partners in the fullest sense of the word, not just a shared home, but a scheme. And they rely on the fact that most landlords are decent people who want to resolve things reasonably, who feel uncomfortable with conflict, and who simply aren't prepared for someone who has no intention of playing fair. Knowing that this type of fraud exists, recognizing the pattern, understanding the mechanics, is the first step to not becoming a victim of it. At the end of the day, remember that while the real Bonnie and Clyde went out in a blaze of bullets, these modern-day hustlers prefer to go out in a blaze of eviction notices and fake complaints.
Next time on Fraud Files, we will hear the story of a family that were traumatized by imposters. In an episode entitled Call the Police, Edward will recount the chilling details and a family's worst nightmare. Until next time, please get in touch with us. Let us know about your experiences of frauds and scams, and any questions you would like us to answer and discuss on future episodes. info@fraud-files.com.
Fraud Files is produced by Rock Solid Pods in association with the Podhouse Productions. Fraud Files is available on Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and wherever you get your podcasts.